I thought that's what you said. I didn't believe it the first time either. Oh, I don't take risks. About the most exciting thing that happened to me was knocking some ink over. I assess risks, day after day. Do you know what the odds are against a house catching fire in the Red Triangle district of Best Pelagic? 538 to 1. I calculated that, he added with a trace of pride. What? Rincewind tried to suppress a burp. What for? Excuse me. He helped himself to some more wine. For... Two-Flower paused. I can't say it in Trob, he said. I don't think the Betrobi have a word for it. In my language we called it... He said a collection of outlandish syllables. Insular ants, repeated Rincewind. That's a funny word. What does it mean? Well, suppose you have a ship loaded with, say, gold bars. It might run into storms or be taken by pirates. You don't want that to happen, so you take out an insure ants policy. I work out the odds against the cargo being lost based on weather reports and piracy records for the last 20 years, then I add a bit, then you pay me some money based on those odds. And the bit? Rincewind said, waggling a finger solemnly. And then, if the cargo is lost, I reimburse you. Reimburse? Pay you the value of your cargo, said Two-Flower patiently. I get it. It's like a bet, right? A wager. In a way, I suppose. And you make money at this in-sewer ants. It offers a return on investment, certainly. Wrapped in the warm yellow glow of the wine, Rincewind tried to think of in-sewer ants in Circle C terms. I don't think I understand in-sewer ants, he said firmly. I'm watching the world straight line. Magic? Magic, I understand. Two-Flower grinned. Magic is one thing, and the reflected sound of underground spirits is another, he said. What? That funny word you used, said Rincewind impatiently. Reflected sound of underground spirits? Never heard of it. Two-Flower tried to explain. Rincewind tried to understand. In the long afternoon, they toured the city turnwise of the river. Two-Flower led the way with the strange picture box slung on a strap around his neck. Rincewind trailed behind, whimpering at intervals and checking to see that his head was still there. A few others followed, too. In a city where public executions, duels, fights, magical moves and strange events regularly punctuated the daily round, the inhabitants had brought the profession of interested bystander to a peak of perfection. They were to a man highly skilled. In any case, Two-Flower was delighted to take picture after picture engaged in what he described as typical activities, and since a quarter Rhine was subsequently changed hands for their trouble, a tale of bemused and happy nouveau riche was soon following him in case this madman exploded in a shower of gold. At the temple of the seven-handed Sek, a hasty convocation of priests and ritual heart transplant artisans agreed that the 100-span high statue of Sek was altogether too holy to be made into a magic picture, but a payment of 2 Rhine left them astoundingly agreeing that perhaps he wasn't as holy as all that. A prolonged session at the Hawk Pits produced a number of colourful and instructive pictures, a number of which Rincewind concealed about his person for detailed perusal. As the fumes cleared from his brain, he began to speculate seriously as to how the iconograph worked. Even a failed wizard knew that some substances were sensitive to light. Perhaps the glass plates were treated by some arcane process that froze the light that passed through them. Something like that, anyway. Rincewind often suspected that there was something somewhere that was better than magic. He was usually disappointed. However, he soon took every opportunity to operate the box. Two-Flower was only too pleased to allow this, since that enabled him to appear in his own keeping. It was at this point that Rincewind noticed something strange. Possession of the box conferred a kind of power on the wielder, which was that anyone confronted with the hypnotic glass eye would submissively obey the most intellectual stance and expression. It was while he was thus engaged in the plaza of broken moves that disaster struck. Two-Flower had posed alongside a bewildered charm seller, his crowd of newfound admirers watching him with interest in case he did something humorously lunatic. Rincewind got down on one knee, the better to arrange the picture, and pressed the enchanted lever. The boss said,
"It's no good. I've run out of paint."
The hitherto unnoticed door opened in front of his eyes. A small green and hideously warty humanoid figure leaned out, pointed at colour-encrusted palette in one clawed hand, and screamed at him.
"No pink, see?"
Screeched the homunculus.
"No good you going on pressing the lever when there's no pink, is there? If you wanted pink, you shouldn't have took all those pictures of young legs shooting. It's monochrome from now on. All right."
In one dim corner of the little box, he thought he could see an easel and a tiny unmade bed. He hoped he couldn't.
"So long as that's understood,"
said the imp, and shut the door. Rincewind thought he could hear the muffled sound of rumbling and the scrape of a stool being dragged across the floor. Two-Flower and looked up. Two-Flower had vanished. As Rincewind stared at the crowd with sensations of prickly horror travelling up his spine, there came a gentle prod in the small of his back. "Turn without hate," said a voice like Blackstone, "or kiss your kidneys goodbye." The crowd watched with interest. It was turning out to be quite a Rincewind turned slowly, feeling the point of the sword scrape along his ribs. At the other end of the blade, he recognised Strend Whittle, thief, cruel swordsman, disgruntled contender for the title of worst man. "Hi," he said weakly. A few yards away, he noticed a couple of unsympathetic men raising the lid of the luggage and pointing excitedly at the bags of gold. Whittle smiled. It made an unnerving effect on his scar-crossed face. "I know you," he said. "A gutter wizard. What is that thing?" Rincewind became aware that the lid of the luggage was trembling slightly, although there was no wind. And he was still holding the picture box. "This makes pictures," he said brightly. "Hey, just hold that smile, will you?" He backed away quickly and pointed the box. For a moment, Whittle hesitated. "What?" he said. "That's fine. Hold it just like that," said Rincewind. The thief paused, then growled, and swung his sword back. There was a snap and a duet of horrible screams. Rincewind did not glance round for fear of the terrible thing he might see, and by the time Rincewind looked at him again, he was on the other side of the plaza and still accelerating. The Albatross descended in wide, slow sweeps that ended in an undignified flutter of feathers and a thump as it landed heavily on its platform in the patrician's bird garden. The custodian of the birds, dozing in the sun and hardly expecting a long-distance message so soon after this morning's arrival, jerked to his feet and looked up. A few moments later, he was scuttling through the palace's corridors, holding the message capsule, and, owing to carelessness brought on by surprise, sucking at the nasty beak wound on the back of his hand. Rincewind pounded down an alley, paying no heed to the screams of rage coming from the picture box, and cleared a high wall with his frayed robe flapping around him like the feathers of a dishevelled jackdaw. He landed in the front of the shop, scattering the merchandise and customers, dived through its rear exit, trailing apologies, skidded down another alley, and stopped, teetering dangerously, just as he was about to plunge unthinkingly into the Ankh. There are said to be some mystic rivers, one drop of which can steal a man's life away. After its turbid passage through the twin cities, the Ankh could have been one of them. In the distance, the cries of rage took on a shrill note of terror. Rincewind looked around desperately for a boat, or a handhold up the sheer walls on either side of him. He was trapped. Unbidden, the spell welled up in his mind. It was perhaps untrue to say that he had learned it. It had learned him. The episode had led to his expulsion from the Unseen University, because, for a bet, he had dared to open the pages of the last remaining copy of the Creator's own grimoire, the Octavo, while the university librarian was otherwise engaged. The spell had leapt out of the page and instantly burrowed deeply into his mind, from whence even the combined talents of the Faculty of Medicine had been unable to coax it. Precisely which one it was they were also unable to ascertain, except that it was one of the 8 basic spells that were intricately interwoven with the very fabric of time and space itself. Since then, it had been showing a worrying tendency, when Rincewind was feeling run down, or especially threatened, to try to get itself said. He clenched his teeth together, but the first syllable forced itself around the corner of his mouth. His left hand raised involuntarily, and as the magical force whirled him round, he began to give octarine sparks. The luggage hurtled around the corner, its several hundred knees moving like pistons. Rincewind gaped. The spell died unsaid. The box didn't appear to be hampered in any way by the ornamental rug draped rosily over it, nor by the thief hanging by one arm from the lid. It was, in a very real sense, a dead weight. Further along the lid were the remains of 2 fingers, owner unknown. The luggage halted a few feet from the wizard, and after a moment retracted its legs. It had no eyes that Rincewind could see, but he was nevertheless sure that it was staring at him, expectantly. "Shoo," he said weakly. It didn't budge, but the lid creaked open, releasing the dead thief. Rincewind remembered about the gold. Presumably, the box had to have a master. In the absence of 2, had it adopted him? The tide was turning, and he could see debris drifting downstream in the yellow afternoon light towards the river gate, 2 yards downstream. It was the work of a moment to let the dead thief join them. Even if it was found later, it would hardly cause comment, and the sharks in the estuary were used to solid, regular meals. Rincewind watched the body drift away and considered his next move. The luggage would probably float. All he had to do was wait until dusk, and then go out with the tide. There were plenty of wild places downstream where he could wade ashore. Then, well, if the patrician really had sent out word about him, then a change of clothing and a shave would take care of that. In any case, there were other lands and other languages. Let him forget Chimera, or Gonim, or Ekalpon, and half a dozen armies couldn't bring him back. And then, wealth, comfort, security. There was, of course, the problem of Two-Flower. Rincewind allowed himself a moment's sadness. "It could be worse," he said by way of farewell. "It could be me." It was when he tried to move that the road was caught on some obstruction. Feeling his neck, he found that the edge of it was being gripped firmly by the luggage's lid. "Oh, Gorfowl," said the patrician pleasantly. "Come in, sit down. Can I press you to a candid starfish?" "I am used to command, master," said the old man calmly, "save perhaps in the matter of preserved echinoderms." The patrician shrugged and indicated the scroll on the table. "Read that," he said. Gorfowl picked up the parchment and raised one eyebrow slightly when he saw the familiar ideograms of the Golden Empire. He read in silence for perhaps a minute, and then turned the scroll over to examine minutely the seal on the objects. "You are famed as a student of Empire affairs," said the patrician. "Can you explain this?" "Knowledge in the matter of the Empire lies less in noting particular events than in studying a certain cast of mind," said the old diplomat. "The message is curious, yes, but not surprising. This morning the Emperor instructed," the patrician allowed himself the luxury of a scowl, "instructed me, Gorfowl, to protect this Two-Flower person. Now it seems I must have him killed. You don't find that surprising?" "No. The Emperor is no more. He is idealistic, keen, a god to his people. Whereas this afternoon's letter is, unless I am very much mistaken, from 9 Turning Mirrors, the Grand Vizier. He has grown old in the service of several emperors. He regards them as a necessary but tiresome ingredient in the successful running of the Empire. He does not like things the Empire was not built by allowing things to get out of place. That is his view. I begin to see," said the patrician. Quite so.
Keep pressing them.
Gorfowl smiled into his beard. This tourist is a thing that is out of place. After acceding to his master's wishes 9 turns and arrangements with a view to ensuring that one wanderer would not be allowed to return home, bringing perhaps the disease of dissatisfaction. The Empire likes people to stay where it puts them. So much more convenient then if this two-flower disappears for good in the barbarian lands. Meaning him, master. And your advice? Said the patrician. Gorfowl shrugged. Merely that you should do nothing. Matters will undoubtedly resolve themselves. However, he scratched an ear thoughtfully. Perhaps the Assassin's Guild? Ah, yes, said the patrician. The Assassin's Guild. Who is their president? Zlork Flannelfoot, master. Have a word with him, will you? Quite so, master. The patrician nodded. It was all rather a relief. He agreed with 9 turning mirrors. Life was difficult enough. People ought to stay where they were put. Brilliant constellations shone down on the Discworld. One by one, the traders shuttered their shops. One by one, the Golnots, thieves, firewire, whores, illusionists, backsliders, and second-story men awoke from breakfast. Wizards went about their polydimensional affairs. Tonight saw the conjunction of 2 powerful planets, and already the air over the magical quarter was hazy with early spells. Look, said Rincewind, this isn't getting us anywhere. Inched sideways. The luggage followed faithfully, half open and menacing. Rincewind briefly considered making a desperate leap to safety. The lid smacked in anticipation. In any case, he told himself that the damn thing would only follow him again. It had that dogged look about it. Even if he managed to get to a horse, he had a nasty suspicion that it would follow him at its own pace, endlessly, swimming rivers and oceans, gaining slowly every night while he had to stop to sleep. And then one day in some exotic city and years hence, he'd hear the sound of hundreds of tiny feet accelerating down the road behind him. You've got the wrong man, he moaned. It's not my fault. I didn't kidnap him. The box moved forward slightly. Now there was just a narrow strip of green eddy between Rincewind's heels and the river. A flash of precognition told him that the box would be able to swim faster than he could. He tried not to imagine what it would be like to drown in the Ark.
It won't stop until you give in, you know,
said a small voice, conversationally. Rincewind looked down at the iconograph, still hanging around his neck. Its trapdoor was open, and the homunculus was leaning against the frame, smoking a pipe and watching the proceedings with amusement. I'll take you in with me at least, said Rincewind through gritted teeth. The imp took the pipe out of his mouth.
What did you say?
He said. I said I'll take you in with me, damn it.
Suit yourself.
The imp tapped the side of the box meaningfully.
We'll see who sinks first.
The luggage yawned and moved forward a fraction of an inch. Oh, all right, said Rincewind irritably, but you'll have to give me time to think. The luggage backed off slowly. Rincewind edged his way back onto reasonably safe land and sat down with his back against a wall. Across the river, the lights of Ankh City glowed.
You're a wizard, said the picture imp. You'll think of some way to find him.
Not much of a wizard, I'm afraid.
You can just jump down on everyone and turn them into worms,
the imp added encouragingly, ignoring this last remark. No, turning to animals is an 8th level spell. I never even completed my training. I only know one spell.
Well, that'll do.
I doubt it, said Rincewind hopelessly.
What does it do then?
Can't tell you. Don't really want to talk about it. But frankly, he sighed, no spells are much good. It takes 3 months to commit even a simple one to memory, and then once you've used it, poof, it's gone. That's what's so stupid about the whole magic thing, you know. You spend 20 years learning a spell that makes nude virgins appear in your bedroom, and then you're so poisoned by quicksilver fumes and half blind from reading old grimoires that you can't remember what happens next.
I never thought of it like that,
said the imp. Hey, look, this is all wrong. When Toonflower said they'd got better kind of magic in the Empire, I thought... The imp looked at him expectantly. Rincewind cursed himself. Well, if you must know, I thought he didn't mean magic. Not as such.
What else is there then?
Rincewind began to feel really wretched. I don't know. A better way of doing things, I suppose. Something with a bit of sense in it. Harnessing the lightning or something. The imp gave him a kind of pitying look.
Lightning is the spears hurled by the thunder giants when they fight, it said gently. Established meteorological fact. You can't harness it.
I know, said Rincewind miserably. That's the flaw in the argument, of course. The imp nodded and disappeared into the depths of the iconograph. A few moments later, Rincewind smelled frying bacon. He waited until his stomach couldn't stand the strain anymore and rapped on the box. The imp reappeared.
I've been thinking about what you said,
it said before Rincewind could open his mouth.
And even if you could get a harness on it, how could you get it to pull a cart?
What the hell are you talking about?
Lightning. It just goes up and down. You'd want it to go along, not up and down. Anyway, it probably burn through the harness.
I don't care about the light. How can I think on an empty stomach?
Eat something then, that's logic.
How? Every time I move, that damn box flexes its hinges at me. The luggage, on cue, gaped widely. See?
It's not trying to bite you, said the imp. There's food in there. You're no use to it starved.
Rincewind peered into the dark recesses of the luggage. There were indeed, among the chaos of boxes and bags of gold, several bottles and packages in oiled paper. He gave a sinister glance, reached around the abandoned jetty until he found a piece of wood about the right length, wedged it as politely as possible in the gap between the lid and the box, and pulled out one of the flat packages. It held biscuits that turned out to be as hard as diamond wood. Bloody hell, he muttered, nursing his teeth.
Captain Ace Travellers Digestives then,
said the imp from the doorway to his box.
Saved many life at sea, they have.
Oh, sure. You use them as a raft or just throw them to the sharks and sort of watch them sink? What's in the bottle? Poison?
Water.
But there's water everywhere. Why do you want to bring water?
Trust.
Trust?
Yes, that's what he didn't. The water. Here, see?
Rincewind opened the bottle. The liquid inside might have been water. It had a flat, empty flavour with no trace of life. Neither taste nor smell, he grumbled. The luggage gave a little creak, attracting his attention. With a lazy air of calculated menace, it shut its lid slowly, grinding Rincewind like a polishing wedge like a dry loaf. All right, he said. I'm thinking. Seymour's headquarters were in the leaning tower at the junction of Rhyme Street and Frost Alley. At midnight, the solitary guard leaning in the shadows looked up at the conjoining planets and wondered idly what change in his fortunes they might herald. There was the faintest sounds, as of a gnat yawning. The guard glanced down at the deserted street and now caught the glimmer of moonlight on something lying in the mud a few yards away. He picked it up. The lunar light gleamed on gold, and his intake of breath was almost loud enough to echo down. There was a slight sound again, and another coin rolled into the gutter on the opposite end of the street. By the time he had picked it up, there was another one, a little way off and still spinning. Gold was, he remembered, said to be formed from the crystallized light of stars. Until now, he had never believed it to be true, that something as heavy as gold could form from stars. As he drew level with the opposite alley mouth, some more fell. It was still in his bag, there was a little, and Rincewind brought it down heavily onto his head. When the guard came to, he found himself looking up into the wild-eyed face of a woman who was menacing his throat with a sword. In the darkness, too, something was gripping his leg. It was the disconcerting sort of grip that suggested that the gripper could grip a whole lot harder. Where is he, the rich foreigner? Hissed the wizard, quickly.
What's holding my leg?
Said the man with a note of terror in his voice. He tried to rip it free. The pressure increased. You wouldn't want to know, said Rincewind, Pay attention, please. Where's the foreigner? Not here. They've got him at the Everyone's looking for him. You're Rincewind, aren't you? The box that bites people. Oh, no, please. Rincewind is gone. The guard found the unseen leg gripper. Or, as he was beginning to fear, its hold. Then, as he tried to pull himself to his feet, something big and heavy and square cannoned into him out of the dark and plunged off afterwards. With only his homemade phrasebook to help him, Two-Flower was trying to explain the mysteries of in-sewer ants to Broadman. The fat innkeeper was listening intently with little black eyes. From the other end of the table, Imor watched with mild amusement, occasionally feeding one of his ravens with scraps from his plate. Beside him, Whitfield paced up and down. You fret too much, said Imor, without taking his eyes from the two men opposite him. I can feel it, Stren. Who will dare attack us here? And the Gutter Wizard will come. He's too much of a coward not to. And he'll try to bargain, and we shall have him. And the gold. And the chest. Withelm's one eye glared, and he smacked a fist into the palm of a black-gloved hand. Who would have thought that there was so much sapient pearwood in the whole of the disc, he said. How could we have known? You fret too much, Stren. I'm sure you can do better this time, said Imor pleasantly. The lieutenant snorted in disgust and strode off round the room to bully his men. Imor carried on watching the tourists. It was strange, but the little man didn't seem to realise the seriousness of his position. Imor had on several occasions seen him look around the room with an expression of deep satisfaction. He had also been talking for ages to Broadman, and Imor had seen a piece of paper change there, and Broadman had seen the foreigner's coins. It was strange. When Broadman got up and waddled past Imor's chair, the thief-master's arm shot out like a steel spring and grabbed the fat man by his apron. What was all that about, friend? Asked Imor quietly. Nothing, just private business like. There are no secrets between friends, Broadman? Yeah, well, I'm not sure about it myself, said the innkeeper nervously. In-sewer ants, it's called. It's like a bet that the broken drum won't get burned down. Imor held the man's gaze until Broadman twitched in fear and embarrassment. Then the thief-master laughed. This worm-eaten old tinder pile, he said. The man must be mad. Yes, but mad with money. He says now he's got the, I can't remember the word, begins with a P. It's what you might call the stake bunny. The people he works for in the Agatean Empire will pay up if the broken drum burns down. Not that I hope it does burn down. The broken drum, I mean, it's like a home to me, is the drum. Not entirely stupid, are you? Said Imor, and pushed the innkeeper away. The door slammed back on its hinges and thudded into the wall. Hey, that's my door! Screamed Broadman. Then he realised who was standing at the top of the steps and ducked behind the table, a mere shaving of time before a short black dart sped across the room and thunked into the woodwork. Imor moved his hand carefully and poured out another flagon of beer. Won't you join me, Zlorf? He said levelly. And put that sword away, Stren. Zlorf Flannelfoot is our friend. The president of the Assassin's Guild spun his short blowgun dexterously and slotted it into its holster in one smooth movement. Strand, said Imor. The black-clad thief hissed and sheathed his sword, but he kept his hand on the hilt and his eyes on the assassin. That wasn't easy. The motive of the Assassin's Guild was by competitive examination, the practical being the most important, indeed the only part. Thus, Zlorf's broad, honest face was a wealth of scar tissue, the result of many a close encounter. It probably hadn't been all that good looking in any case. It was said that Zlorf had chosen a profession in which dark hoods, cloaks, and nocturnal prowlings figured largely because there was a day-fearing trollish streak in his parentage. People who said this in earshot of Zlorf tended to carry their ears too. He strolled down the stairs, followed by a number of assassins. When he was directly in front of Imor, he said, I've come for the tourist. Is it any business of yours?
Yes. Grinjo. Ermund. Take him.
Two of the assassins stepped forward, then strength his sword appearing to materialize an inch from their throats without having to the air. Possibly I could only kill one of you, he murmured, but I suggest you ask yourselves which one. Look up, Sloth, said Emor. A row of yellow-veiled flies looked down from the darkness among the rocks. One step more, and you'll leave here with fewer eyeballs than you came with, said the thief master. So, sit down and have a drink, Sloth, and let's talk about it. Sensible. I thought we had an agreement. You don't rob, I don't kill. Not for payment, that is, he added after a pause. Sloth took the proffered beer.
So,
He said,
I'll kill him. Then you rob him. Is he that funny-looking one over there?
yes. Sloth stared at Toothlauer. He shrugged. He seldom wasted time wondering why people wanted other people dead. Who is your client, may I ask? Said Emor. Sloth held up a hand.
Please.
He protested. Of course. By the way,
Yes.
I believe I have a couple of guards outside. And some others in the doorway across the street.
Formerly.
And two both on the roof. A flicker of doubt passed across Sloth's face, like the last shaft of sunlight over a badly ploughed field. The door flew open, badly damaging the assassin who was standing beside it.
Keep pressing them.
"Stop doing that!" shrieked Broadman from under the table. Sloth and Emor stared up at the figure on the threshold. It was short, fat, and richly dressed. Very richly dressed. There were a number of tall, big shapes looming behind it. Very big, threatening shapes.
Grenade!
Who's that?
Said Sloth. I know him. His name's Stren. He runs the Roaming Platter Tavern down by Brass Bridge. Stren Rurp held up a beringed hand. Stren Whiffel hesitated halfway to the door as several very large trolls ducked under the doorway and stood on either side of the fat man, blinking in the light. Muscles the size of melons bulged in forearms like flower cells. Each troll held a double-headed axe between thumb and forefinger. Broadman erupted from cover, his face suffused with rage. "Out!" he screamed. "Get those trolls out of here!" No. The room was suddenly quiet. Broadman looked around quickly. It began to dawn on him just what he had said, and to whom. A whimper escaped from his lips. Glad to be free, he reached the doorway to his cellars, just as one of the trolls, with a leaping flick of one ham-sized hand, sent his axe whirling across the room. The slam of the door and its subsequent splitting as the axe hit it merged into one sound.
Bloody hell.
Exclaimed Lord Flannelfoot. "What do you want?" said Emor.
I am here on behalf of the Guild of Merchants and Traders,
said Rurp evenly.
to protect meaning the little man.
Emor wrinkled his brows. "I'm sorry," he said. "I thought I heard you say the Guild of Merchants."
And traders.
Agreed Rurp. Behind him now, in addition to more trolls, were several youths that Emor vaguely recognized. He had seen them mainly behind counters and bars, shadowy figures usually, easily forgotten. At the back of his mind, a bad feeling began to grow. He thought about how it might be to be, say, a fox confronted with an angry sheep. A sheep, moreover, that could afford to employ goods. "How long has this, guild been in existence, may I ask?" he said.
Since this afternoon, said Ruff. I'm Vice Guildmaster in charge of tourism, you know.
What is this tourism of which you speak?
We are not quite sure.
Said Ruff. An old bearded man poked his head over the guildmaster's shoulder and cackled.
Speaking on behalf of the wine cellars of Moorpork, tourism is... See?
Objective
Well,
complete.
said Emor coldly.
Well,
Said Ruff. Thieves out! Thieves out! Cackled the old man. Several others took up the chant. Zlorf grinned.
and assassins.
Chanted the old man. Zlorf growled.
Stands to reason,
Said Brett.
people robbing and murdering all over the place. What sort of impression is this going to take away? You come all the way to see our fine city with its many points of historical and civic interest, also many quaint customs, and you wake up dead in some back alley, or as it might be sitting down the Eck. How are you going to tell all your friends what a great time you're having? Let's face it, you've got to move with the times.
Zlorf and Emor met each other's gaze. We have we? Said Emor. Then let us look, brother, agreed Zlorf. In one movement he brought his blow out of the ground and set it up, hitting the nearest troll. It spun around, hurling its axe, which whirred over the assassin's head and buried itself in a luckless leaf behind him. Rurp ducked, allowing a troll to raise his huge iron crossbow and fire a spear-length quarrel into the nearest assassin. Stop. It has been remarked before that those who are sensitive to radiations in the far octary, the eighth colour, the imagination, can see things that others cannot. Thus it was that Rincewind, hurrying through the crowded, flare-lit evening bazaars of Moorpork with the luggage trundling behind him, jostled a tall, dark figure, turned to deliver a few suitable curses, and beheld death. It had to be death. No one else went around with empty eye sockets. And of course the scythe over one shoulder was another clue. As Rincewind stared in horror, a courting couple, laughing at some private joke, walked straight through the apparition without appearing to notice it. Death, insofar as it was possible in a face with no movable features, looked surprised.
Rincewind?
Said Rincewind, trying to back away from that eyeless stare.
But why are you here?
Boom, boom, went crypt lids in the worm-haunted fastness under old mountains. Why not? Said Rincewind. Anyway, I'm sure you've got lots to do, so if you'll just...
I was surprised that you jostled me, Rincewind, for I have an appointment with thee this very night.
Oh, no, not...
Of course, what's so bloody vexing about the whole business is that I was expecting to meet thee in Psephopolis.
But that's 500 miles away.
You don't have to tell me. The whole system's got screwed up again. I can see that. Look, there's no chance of you...
Rincewind backed away, hands spread protectively in front of him. The dried fish salesman on a nearby stall watched this madman with interest. Not a chance.
I could lend you a very fast horse.
No!
It won't hurt a bit.
No! Rincewind turned and ran. Death watched him go and shrugged bitterly.
Sod you, then.
He turned and noticed the fish salesman. With a snarl, Death reached out a bony finger and stopped the man's heart. But he didn't take much pride in it. Then, Death remembered what was due to happen later that night. It would not be true to say that Death smiled, because in any case his features were perforce frozen in a calcareous grin. But he hummed a little tune, cheery as a plague pit, and pausing only to extract the life from a passing mayfly, and 1/9 of the lives from a cat cowering under the fish stall. All cats can see into the octarine. Death turned on his heel and set off towards the broken drum. Short Street, Moorpork, is in fact one of the longest in the city. Filigree Street crosses its turnwise end in the manner of the crosspiece of a T, and the broken drum is so placed that it looks down the full length of the street. At the furthermost end of Short Street, a dark oblong rose up from the tiny legs and started to run. At first it moved at no more than a lumbering trot, but by the time it was halfway up the street, it was moving arrow fast. A darker shadow inched its way along one of the walls of the drum, a few yards from the two trolls who were guarding the door. Rincewind was sweating. They heard the faint clinking of the specially prepared bags at his belt. One of the trolls tapped his colleague on the shoulder, producing a noise like two pebbles being knocked together. He pointed down the road. Rincewind darted from his hiding place, turned, and hurled his burden through the drum's nearest window. Withel saw it arrive. The bag arced across the room, turning slowly in the air, and burst on the edge of a table. A moment later, gold coins were rolling across the floor, spinning, glittering. The room was suddenly silent, save for the tiny noises of gold and the screams of the wounded. With a curse, Withel dispatched the assassin he had been fighting. "It's a trick," he screamed. "No one move!" 70 men and a dozen trolls froze in mid-grope. Then, for the third time, the door burst open. Two trolls hurried through, slammed it behind them, dropped the heavy bar across it, and fled down the stairs. Outside, there was a sudden crescendo of running feet, and for the last time, the door opened. In fact, it exploded, the great wooden bar being hurled far across the room, and the frame itself giving way. Door and frame landed on a table, which flew into pieces. It was then that the frozen fighters noticed that there was something else in the pile of wood. It was a box, shaking itself madly to free itself of the smashed timber around it. Rincewind appeared in the ruined doorway, hurling another of his gold grenades. It smashed into a wall, showering coins. Down in the cellar, Broadman looked up, muttered to himself, and carried on with his work. His entire Spindlewinter's supply of candles had already been strewn on the floor, mixed with his store of kindling wood. Now he was attacking a barrel of lamp oil. "Insurance," he muttered. Oil gushed out and swirled around his feet. Withel stormed across the floor, his face a mask of rage. Rincewind took careful aim and caught the thief full in the chest with a bag of gold. But now Emor was shouting and pointing an accusing finger. A raven swooped down from its perch in the rafters and dived at the wizard, talons open and gleaming. It didn't make it. At about the halfway point, the luggage leapt from its bed of splinters, gaped briefly in midair, and snapped shut. It landed lightly. Rincewind saw its lid open again, slightly. Just far enough for a tongue, large as a palm leaf, red as mahogany, to lick up a few errant feathers. At the same moment, the giant candle wheel fell from the ceiling, plunging the room into gloom. Rincewind, coiling himself like a spring, gave a standing jump and grasped the beam, swinging himself up into the relative safety of the room with a strength that amazed him.
Exciting, isn't it?
Then a voice cried. Down below, assassins, trolls and merchants all realized at about the same moment that they were in a room made treacherous of foothold by gold coins and containing something among the suddenly menacing shapes in the semi-darkness that was absolutely horrible. As one, they made for the door, but had 24 different recollections of its exact position. High above the chaos, Rincewind stared at Twoflower. He hit him. "How come you're up here?"
I thought I'd better not get in everybody's way.
Rincewind considered this. There didn't seem to be much he could say. Twoflower added,
A real brawl. Better than anything I'd imagined. Do you think I ought to thank them, or did you arrange it?
Rincewind looked at him blankly. "I think we ought to be getting down now," he said hollowly. "Everyone's gone." He dragged Twoflower across the littered floor and up the steps. They burst out into the tail end of the night. There were still a few stars, but the moon was down, and there was a faint grey glow to windward. Most important, the street was empty. Rincewind sniffed. "Can you smell oil?" he said. Then, Withel stepped out of the shadows. At the top of the cellar steps, Broadman knelt down and fumbled in his tinderbox. It turned out to be Daphne. "I'll kill that bloody cat," he muttered, and groped for the spare box that was normally on the ledge by the door. It was missing. Broadman said that word. A lighted taper appeared in mid-air right beside him. "Here, take this." "Thanks," said Broadman. "Don't mention it." Broadman threw the taper down the steps. His hand paused in mid-air. He looked at the taper, his brow furrowing. Then he turned around and held the taper up to illuminate the scene. It didn't shed much light, but it did give the darkness a shade. "Oh, no!" breathed.
But yes.
Said Death. Rincewind rolled. For a moment, he thought Withel was going to spit him where he lay, but it was worse than that. He was waiting for him to get up. I see you have a sword, wizard, he said quietly. I see you rise, and we shall see how well you use it. Rincewind stood up as slowly as he dared, and drew from his belt the short sword he'd taken from the guard a few hours and 100 years ago. It was a short, blunt affair compared to Withel's hair-thin rapier. But I don't know how to use the sword, he wailed. You know that wizards can't be killed by edged weapons, said Rincewind desperately. Withel smiled coldly. So I have heard, he said. I look forward to putting it to the test. He lunged. Rincewind caught the thrust by sheer luck, jerked his hand away in shock, deflected the second stroke by coincidence, and took the third one through his robe at heart rate. There was a click. Withel's snarl of triumph died in his throat. He drew the sword out and prodded again at the wizard, who was rigid with terror and guilt. There was another clink, and gold coins began to drop out of the hem of the wizard's robe.
So you bleed gold, do you?
Hissed Withel.
But have you got gold concealed in that raggedy beard, you little...
As his sword went back for his final sweep, the sullen glow that had been growing in the doorway of the broken drum flickered, dimmed, and erupted into a roaring fireball that sent the walls billowing outward and carried the roof 100 feet into the air before bursting through it in a gap of red-hot tide. Withel stared at the boiling flames, unnerved, and Rincewind leapt. He ducked under the thief's sword arm and brought his own blade around in an arc so incompetently misjudged that it hit the man flat first and jolted out of the wizard's hand. Sparks and droplets of flaming oil rained down as Withel reached out with both gauntleted hands and grabbed Rincewind's neck, forcing him down.
You did this, he screamed. You and your box of trickery.
Great teamwork.
His thumb found Rincewind's windpipe. This is it, the wizard thought. Wherever I'm going, it can't be worse than here.
Excuse me,
said Two-Flower. Rincewind felt the grip lessen. And now Withel was slowly getting up, a look of absolute hatred on his face. A glowing ember landed on the wizard. He brushed it off hurriedly and scrambled to his feet. Two-Flower was behind Withel, holding the man's own needle-sharp sword with the point resting in the small of the thief's back. Rincewind's eyes narrowed. He reached into his robe, then withdrew his hand bunched into a fist. Don't move, he said.
Am I doing this right?
Asked Two-Flower anxiously. He says he'll skewer your liver if you move, Rincewind translated freely. I doubt it, said Withel. Bet? No. As Withel teased himself to turn on the tourist, Rincewind lashed out and caught the thief on the jaw. Withel stared at him in amazement for a moment, and then quietly toppled into the mud. The wizard uncurled his stinging fist, and the roll of gold coins slipped between his throbbing fingers. He looked down at the recumbent thief. Good grief, he gasped. He looked up and yelled as another ember landed on his neck. Flames were racing along the rooftops on either side of the street. All around him, people were hurling possessions from windows and dragging horses from smoking stables. Another explosion in the white-hot volcano that was the drum sent a whole marble mantelpiece scything overhead. The Widdershin Gate's the nearest, Rincewind shouted above the crackle of collapsing rafters. Come on! He grabbed Two-Flower's reluctant arm and dragged him down the street. My luggage! Blast your luggage! Stay here much longer and you'll go where you don't need luggage. Come on! Screamed Rincewind. They jogged on through the crowd of frightened people leaving the area, while the wizard took great mouthfuls of cool dawn air. Something was puzzling him. I'm sure all the candles went out, he said. So how did the drum catch fire? I don't know, moaned Two-Flower. It's terrible, Rincewind. We were getting along so well, too. Rincewind stopped in astonishment, so that another refugee cannoned into him and spun away with an oath. Getting on? Yes, a great bunch of fellows. I thought language was a bit of a problem, but they were so keen for me to join their party, they just wouldn't take no for an answer. Really friendly people, I thought. Rincewind started to correct him, then realized he didn't know how to begin. It'll be a blow for old Broadman, Two-Flower continued. Still, he was wise. I've still got the Rhino he paid for his first premium. Rincewind didn't know the meaning of the word premium, but his mind was working fast. You in-sewered the drum, he said. You bet Broadman it wouldn't catch fire. Oh yes, standard valuation, 200 Rhino. Why do you ask? Rincewind turned and stared at the flames racing towards them, and wondered how much of Ankh-Morpork could be bought for 200 Rhino. Quite a large piece, he decided. Only not now. Not the way those flames were moving. He glanced down at the tourist. You... he began, and searched his memory for the worst word in the Trob tongue. The happy little Betrobi didn't really know how to swear properly. You... he repeated. Another hurrying figure bumped into him, narrowly missing him with the blade over its shoulder. Winston's tortured temper exploded. You little... such a one who, while wearing a copper nose ring, stands in a footbath atop Mount Rua 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 during a heavy thunderstorm and shouts that Alohura, goddess of lightning, has the facial features of a diseased Ularua Hua root.
Just doing my job,
said the figure, stalking away. Every word said was marvel. Moreover, Rincewind was certain that he was the only one who heard. He grabbed Two-Flower again. Let's get out of here, he suggested. One interesting side effect of the fire in Ankh-Morpork concerns the in-sewer ants policy, which left the city through the ravaged roof of the broken drum, was wafted high into the Discworld's atmosphere on the ensuing thermal, and came to Earth several days and a few thousand miles away on an Uloruaha bush in the Betrobi Islands. The simple, laughing islanders subsequently worshipped it as a god, much to the amusement of their mortals.
Reload!
Strangely enough, the rainfall and harvests in the next few years were almost supernaturally abundant, and this led to a research team being dispatched to the islands by the minor religions faculty of the Unseen University. Their verdict was that it only went to show. The fire, driven by the wind, spread out from the drum faster than a man could walk. The timbers of the Widdershin Gate were already on fire when Rincewind, his face blistered and reddened from the flames, reached them. By now, he and Two-Flower were on horseback. Mounts hadn't been that hard to obtain. A wily merchant had asked 50 times their worth, and had been left gaping when 1,000 times their worth had been pressed into his hands. They rode through just before the first of the big gate timbers descended in an explosion of sparks. Morpork was already a cauldron of flame. As they galloped up the red-lit road, Rincewind glanced sideways at his traveller, currently trying hard to learn to ride a horse. Bloody hell. He's alive. Me too. Perhaps the reflected sound of underground spirits. Cumbersome phrase. Rincewind tried to get his tongue around the thick syllables that were the word in Two-Flower's language. Echolyrics, he tried. Ecrogonothics. Ecognomics.
Keep present.
That sounded about right.
Attack reload!
Several hundred yards downriver from the last smouldering suburb of the city, a strangely rectangular and apparently heavily waterlogged object touched the mud on the Widdershin bank. Immediately, it sprouted numerous legs and scrabbled for a purchase. Hauling itself to the top of the bank, the luggage, streaked with soot, stained with water and very, very angry, shook itself and took its bearings. Then it moved away at a brisk trot, a small and incredibly ugly imp that was perching on its lid, watching the scenery with interest. Bravd looked at the weasel and raised his eyebrows. And that's it, said Rincewind. The luggage caught up with us, don't ask me. Is there any more wine? The weasel picked up the empty wineskin.
I think you've just about had enough wine tonight,
Attack
he said.
reload!
Bravd's forehead wrinkled. Gold is gold, he said finally. How can a man with plenty of gold consider himself poor? You're either poor or you're rich. It stands to reason. Rincewind giggled. He was finding reason rather difficult to hold on to. Well, he said, what I think is, the point is, well, you know Octiron? The two adventurers nodded. The strange, iridescent metal was almost as highly valued in the lands around the Circle Sea as sapient pearwood, and was about as rare. The man who owned the made of Octiron never lose his way, since he always pointed to the heart, being acutely sensitive to the disc's magical field. He would miraculously darn his socks. Well, my point is, you see, that gold also has its sort of magical field, sort of financial wizardry, economics. Rincewind giggled. The weasel stood up and stretched. The sun was well up now, and the city below them was wreathed in mists and full of foul vapours. Also gold, he decided. Even a citizen of Moorpork would, at the very point of death, desert his treasure to save his skin. Time to move. The little man called Tooflower appeared to be asleep. The weasel looked down at him and shook his head. The city awaits. Such a... Thank you for a pleasant tale, wizard. What will you do now? He eyed the luggage, which immediately backed away and snapped its lid at him. Well, there are no ships leaving the city now, giggled Rincewind. I suppose we'll take the coast road to Churn. I've got to look after him, you see. But look, I didn't make it up. Sure, said the weasel soothingly. He turned away and swung himself into the saddle of the horse that Braft was holding. A few moments later, the two heroes were just specks under a cloud of dust, heading down towards the charcoal city. Rincewind stared muzzily at the recumbent tourist. At two recumbent tourists. In his somewhat defenseless state, a strange thought, wandering through the dimensions in search of a mind harboring, slid into his brain. Here's another fine mess you've got me into, he moaned, and slumped backwards. Mad, Braft, galloping along a few feet away, nodded. All wizards get like that, he said. It's the quicksilver fumes, rots their brains. Mushrooms, too. However, said the brown-clad one, he reached into his tunic and took out a golden disc on a short chain. Braft raised his eyebrows. The wizard said that the little man had some sort of golden disc that told him the time, said the weasel. Arousing your curiosity, little friend? Reload! You always were an expert thief, weasel. Aye, agreed the weasel modestly. He took it long. It flipped open. The very small demon imprisoned within looked up from its tiny abacus and scowled. It lacks but 10 minutes to 8 of the clock, it snarled. The lid slammed shut, almost trapping the weasel's fingers. With an oath, the weasel hurled the time-teller far out into the heather, where it possibly hit a stone. Something, in any event, caused it. There was a vivid octarine flash, and a whiff of brimstone, as the time being vanished into whatever demonic dimension it called home. What is that for? Said Braft, who hadn't been close enough to hear the words. Do what? Said the weasel. I didn't do anything. Nothing happened at all. Come on, we're wasting opportunities. Braft nodded. Together they turned their steeds and galloped towards ancient Ark and honest enchantments. The Sending of Eight. Prologue. The Discworld offers sights far more impressive than those found built by creators with less imagination, but more mechanical aptitude. Although the Disc's size is hardly bigger than croquet hoops, this slight drawback is set against the tremendous sight of great arch turtle, upon whose ancient and meteor-riddled shell the Disc ultimately rests. Sometimes, in his slow journey across the shores of infinity, he moves his country-sized head to snap at a passing comet. But perhaps the most impressive sight of all, if only because most brains, when faced with the sheer galactic enormity of Artuin, refuse to believe it, is the endless rimfall, where the seas of the Disc boil ceaselessly over the edge into space. Or perhaps it is the Rimbow, the 8-coloured, world-girdling rainbow that hovers in the mist-laden air over the fall. The 8th colour is octarine, caused by the scatter effect of strong sunlight on an intense magical field. Or perhaps again, the most magnificent sight is the Hump. There, a spire of green ice 10 miles high rises through the clouds and supports at its peak the realm of Dunmanifestin, the abode of the Disc gods. The Disc gods themselves, despite the splendour of the world below them, are seldom satisfied. It is embarrassing to know that one is a god of a world that only exists because every improbability curve must have its far end. Especially when one can peer into other dimensions at worlds whose creators had more mechanical aptitude than imagination. No wonder then that the disc gods spend more time in bickering than in omnicognizance. On this particular day, blind Eeyore, by dint of constant vigilance, the chief of the gods, sat with his chin on his hand and looked at the gaming board on the red marble table in front of him. Blind Eeyore had got his name because where his eye sockets should have been, there were nothing but 2 areas of blank skin. His eyes, of which he had an impressively large number, led a semi-independent life of their own. Several were currently hovering above the table. The gaming board was a carefully carved map of the Discworld, overprinted with squares. A number of beautifully modelled playing pieces were now occupying some of the squares. A human onlooker would, for example, have recognised in 2 of them the likenesses of Bravd and the Weasel. Others represented yet more heroes and champions, of which the disc had a more than adequate supply. Still in the game were Eeyore, Offler the crocodile god, Zephyrus the god of slight breezes, Fate, and the Lady. There was an air of concentration around the board now that the lesser players had been removed from the game. Chance had been an early casualty, running her hero into a full house of armed gnolls, the result of a lucky throw by Offler. And shortly afterwards, Night had cashed his chips, pleading an appointment with Destiny. Several minor deities had drifted up and were kibitzing over the shoulders of the players. Side bets were made that the Lady would be the next to leave the board. Her last champion of any standing was now a pinch of still smoking Ankh-Morpork, and there were hardly any pieces that she could promote to first rank. Blind Eeyore took up the dice box, which was a skull whose various orifices had been stopped with wounds, and with several big eyes on the table, he rolled 3 dice. She smiled. This was the nature of the lady's eyes. They were bright green, lacking eyes or pupils, but they glowed from within. The room was silent as she scrabbled in her box of pieces, and from the very bottom produced a couple that she set down on the board with 2 decisive clicks. The rest of the players, as one rod, trained forward.
A renegade Bifford and some sort of clerk,
said Offler the crocodile god, hindered as usual by his tusks.
Well, really?
One hand he pushed a pile of bone-white tokens into the centre of the table. The lady nodded slightly. She picked up the dice cup and held it as steady as a rock. Yet all the gods could hear the 3 cubes rattling about inside. And then she sent them bouncing across the table. A 6, a 3, a 5. Something was happening to the 5, however. Battered by the chance collision of several billion monsters, the dice slipped from the board, spun gently, and came down a 7. Blind Eeyore picked up a piece and counted the sides. Come on, he said wearily. Play fair. The sending of 8. The road from Ankh-Morpork to Churn is high, white and winding. A 30-league stretch of potholes and half-buried rocks that spirals around mountains and dips into cool green valleys of silver trees, crosses liana-webbed gorges on creaking rope bridges, and is generally more picturesque than useful. Picturesque, that was a new word for this unseen university. Failed. It was one of a number he had picked up since leaving the charred ruins of Ankh-Morpork. Quaint was another one. Picturesque meant, he decided after careful observation of the scenery that inspired the flower to use, that the landscape was horribly precipitous. Quaint, when used to describe the occasional village through which they passed, meant fever-ridden and tumble-down. Twoflower was a tourist, the first ever seen on the Discworld. Tourist, Rincewind had decided, meant idiot. As they rode leisurely through the time-scented, bee-humming air, Rincewind pondered on the experiences of the life. While the little foreigner was obviously insane, he was also generous and considerably less lethal than half the people the wizard had mixed with in the city. Rincewind rather liked him. Disliking him would be like kicking a puppy. Currently, Twoflower was showing a great interest in the theory and practice of magic.
It all seems rather useless to me, he said. I always thought that, a wizard just said the magic words and that was that. Not all this tedious memorizing.
Rincewind agreed moodily. He tried to explain that magic had indeed once been wild and lawless, but had been tamed back in the mists of time by the olden ones, who allowed it to obey, among other things, the law of conservation of reality. This demanded that the effort needed to achieve a goal should be the same regardless of the means used. In practical terms, this meant that, say, creating the illusion of one was relatively easy and involved merely a subtle shift. On the other hand, lifting a genuine wine glass a few feet in the air by sheer mental energy required several hours of systematic preparation if the wizard wished to prevent the simple principle of leverage taking his brain out through his ears. He went on to add that some of the ancient magic could still be found in its raw state, recognizable to the initiated by the eightfold shape it made in the crystalline structure of space. There was the metal octyron, for example, and the gas octogen. Both radiated dangerous amounts of raw enchantment. It was all very depressing, he finished. Rincewind turned in his saddle and glanced at Two Flowers' luggage, which was currently ambling along on its little legs, occasionally snapping its lid at Butterfly. He sighed.
Rincewind thinks he ought to be able to harness the lightning,
said the picture imp, who was observing the passing scene from the tiny doorway of the box, slung around Two Flowers' neck. He had spent the morning painting picturesque views and quaint scenes for his master, and had been allowed to knock off for a smoke. When I said harness, snapped Rincewind, I just meant that I just can't think of the right word. I just think the world ought to be more sort of orderly. That's just fantasy, said Two Flowers. No trouble. Rincewind sighed again. It was all very well going on about pure logic and how the universe was ruled by logic and the harmony of numbers, but the plain fact of the matter was that the disk was manifestly traversing space on the back of a giant turtle, and the gods had a habit of going round to atheist houses and smashing their windows. There was a faint sound, hardly louder than the noise of the bees in the rosemary by the road. It had a curiously bony quality, as of rolling skulls or a whirling dice box. Rincewind peered round. There was no one nearby. For some reason, that worried him. Then came a slight bruise, and went in the space of a few heartbeats. It left the world unchanged, save in a few interesting particulars. There was now, for example, a 5-metre-tall mountain troll standing in the road. It was exceptional. This was partly because trolls generally are, in any case, but it was exacerbated by the fact that the sudden and instantaneous teleportation from its lair in the Ramarok Mountains, 3,000 miles away, 1,000 yards away from the rim, had raised its internal temperature to a dangerous level, in accordance with the laws of conservation of energy. So it bared its fangs and charged.
What a strange creature,
Two Flower remarked.
Is it dangerous?
Only to people, shouted Rincewind. He drew his sword, and with a smooth overarm throw, completely failed to hit the troll. The blade plunged on into the heather at the side of the track. There was the faintest of sounds like the rattle of old teeth. The sword struck a boulder concealed in the heather. Concealed, a watcher might have considered, so artfully that a moment before it had not appeared to be there at all. It sprang up like a leaping salmon, and in mid-ricochet plunged deeply into the back of the troll's grave. The creature grunted, and with one swipe of a claw, gouged a wound in the flank of Two Flowers' horse, which screamed and bolted into the trees at the roadside. The troll spun round and made a grab for Rincewind. Then its sluggish nervous system brought the message that it was dead. It looked surprised for a moment. Trolls being silicaceous life forms, their bodies reverted instantly to stone at the moment of death. Ah, thought Rincewind, as his horse reared in terror. He hung on desperately as it staggered two-legged across the road, and then, screaming, turned and galloped into the woods. The sound of hoofbeats died away, leaving the air to the hum of bees and the occasional rustle of butterfly wings. There was another sound, too, a strange noise for the bright time of noonday. It sounded like dice.
End of CD 2. CD 3.
Rincewind? The long aisles of trees threw Two Flowers' voice from side to side, and eventually tossed it back to him unheeded. He sat down on a rock and tried to think. Firstly, he was lost. That was vexing, but it didn't worry him unduly. The forest looked quite interesting, and probably held elves or gnomes, perhaps both. In fact, on a couple of occasions, he had thought he had seen strange green faces peering down at him from the branches. Twoflower had always wanted to meet an elf. In fact, what he really wanted to meet was a dragon, but an elf would do, or a real goblin. His luggage was missing, and that was annoying. It was also starting to rain. He squirmed uncomfortably on the damp stone and tried to look on the bright side. For example, during its mad dash, his plunging horse had burst through some bushes and disturbed the sheep bear with their hooves, but had run on before the bear could react. Then it had suddenly been galloping over the sleeping bodies of a large wolf pack, and again its mad speed had been such that the furious yelping had been left far behind. Nevertheless, the day was wearing on, and perhaps it would be a good idea, Twoflower thought, not to hang about in the open. Perhaps there was a... He racked his brains trying to remember what sort of accommodation forests traditionally offered. Perhaps there was a gingerbread house or something. The stone really was uncomfortable. Twoflower looked down, and for the first time noticed the strange carving. It looked like a spider, or was it a squid? Moss and lichens rather blurred the precise details, but they didn't blur the runes carved below it. Twoflower could read them clearly, and they said, "Traveller, the hospitable temple of Bel-Shamharoth lies 1,000 paces upwards." Now, this was strange. Twoflower realized that although he could read the message, the actual letters were completely unknown to him. Somehow the message was arriving in his brain without the tedious necessity of passing through his eyes. He stood up and untied his now visible horse from a sapling. He wasn't sure which way the hub lay, but there seemed to be an old track of sorts leading away between the trees. This Bel-Shamharoth seemed prepared to go out of his way to help stranded travelers. In any case, was that all the wolves? Twoflower nodded decisively. It is interesting to note that several hours later, a couple of wolves who were following Twoflower's scent arrived in the glade. Their green eyes fell on the strange eight-legged carving, which may indeed have been a spider or an octopus, or may yet again have been something altogether more strange, and they immediately decided that they weren't so hungry at that. About 3 miles away, a failed wizard was hanging by his hands from a high branch in a beech tree. This was the end result of 5 minutes of crowded activity. First, an enraged she-bear had barged through the undergrowth and taken the throat out of his horse with one swipe of her paw. Then, as Rincewind had fled the carnage, he had run into a glade in which a number of irate wolves were milling about. His instructors at Unseen University, who had despaired of Rincewind's inability to master levitation, would have then been amazed at the speed with which he reached and climbed the nearest tree without apparently touching it. Now, it was the matter of the snake. It was large and green, and wound itself along the branch with reptilian patience. Rincewind wondered if it was poisonous, then chided himself for asking such a silly question. Of course it would be poisonous. "What are you grinning for?" he asked the figure on the next branch.
I can't help it. Now would you be so kind as to let go? I can't hang around all day.
"I can," said Rincewind defiantly. The wolves looked up with interest at their next meal, talking to himself.
It won't hurt.
If words had weight, a single sentence from death would have anguished. Rincewind's arms screamed their agony at him. He scowled at the vulture-like, slightly transparent figure. "Won't hurt," he said. "Being torn apart by wolves won't hurt." He noticed another branch crossing his way. If he could just reach it. He swung himself forward, one hand outstretched. The branch, already bending, did not break. It simply made a little wet sound, twisting. Rincewind found that he was now hanging onto the end of a tiny bark spider, lengthening as it peeled away from the tree. He looked down, and with a sort of fatal satisfaction, realized that he would land right on the biggest wolf. Now he was moving slowly as the bark peeled back in a longer and longer strip. The snake watched him thoughtfully. But the growing length of bark held. Rincewind began to congratulate himself until, looking up, he saw what he had hitherto not noticed. There was the largest hornet's nest he had ever seen, hanging right in his path. His eyes shut tightly. Why the troll? He asked himself. Everything else was why the troll? What the hell is going on? click. It may have been a twig snapping, except that the sound appeared to be inside Rincewind's head. Click, click, and a breeze that fails to set a single leaf a-tremble. The hornet's nest was ripped from the branch as the strip passed by. It shot past the wizard's head, and he watched it grow smaller as it plummeted turned muzzle. The circle suddenly closed. The circle suddenly expanded. The concerted yelp of pain as the pack fought to escape the furious cloud echoed among the trees. Rincewind grinned inanely. Rincewind's elbow nudged something. It was the tree trunk. The strip had carried him right to the end of the branch. But there were no other branches. The smooth bark beside him offered no hand. It offered hands, though. Thrusting through the mossy bark beside him. Slim hands, green as young leaves. Then a shapely arm followed. And then the hammer dryad leaned right out and grasped the astonished wizard firmly, and with that vegetable strength that can send roots questing into rock, drew him into the tree. The solid bark parted like a mist, closed like a flame. Death watched impassively. He glanced at the cloud of mayflies that were dancing their joyful zigzags near his skull. He snapped his fingers. The insects fell out of the air. But somehow it wasn't quite the same. Blind pushed his stack of chips across the table, glowered through such of his eyes that were currently in the room, and strode out. A few demigods tittered. At least Offler had taken the loss of the perfect control and precise, if somewhat Artilian grace. The lady's last opponent shifted his seat and faced her across the board.
Throwing grenade!
Lord, she said politely. Lady, he acknowledged. Their eyes met. He was a taciturn god. It was said that he had arrived in the Discworld after some terrible and mysterious incident in another eventuality. It is, of course, the privilege of gods to control their apparent outward form, even to other gods. The fate of the Discworld was currently a kindly man in late middle age, greying hair brushed neatly around the features that a maiden would confidently proffer a glass of small beer to, should they appear at her back door. It was a face a kindly youth would gladly help over a stile. Except for his eyes, of course. No deity can disguise the manner and nature of his eyes. The nature of the two eyes of the face of the Discworld was this, that while at a mere glance they were simply dark, a closer look would reveal, too late, that they were but holes, opening onto a blackness so remote, so deep, that the water inexorably drawn into the twin pools of infinite night and their terrible, wheeling stars. The lady coughed politely and laid 21 white chips on the table. Then from her robe, she took another chip, silvery and translucent, twice the size of the others. The soul of a true hero always finds a better rate of exchange and is valued highly by the gods.
Grenade!
Fate raised an eyebrow. And no cheating, lady, he said. She asked. He shrugged. No one, yet everyone tries. And yet again, I believe I felt you giving me a little assistance. But of course, so that the end game could be the sweeter, lady. And now, he reached into his gaming box and brought forth a piece, setting it down on the board with a satisfied air. The box gave a collective sigh. Even the lady was momentarily. It was so ugly. The carving was uncertain, as if the craftsman's hands were shaking in horror of the thing taking shape under his reluctant fingers. It seemed to be all suckers and tentacles. And mandibles, the lady observed. And one great eye. I thought such as he died out at the beginning of time, she said.
Grenade!
Mayhap our necrotic friend was loath even to go near this, laughed Fate. He was enjoying himself. It should never have been spawned. Nevertheless, said Fate knowingly. He scooped the dice into their unusual box, and then glanced at them. Unless, he added, you wish to resign? She shook her head. Play, she said.
Pressing them.
You can match my stake? Play. Rincewind knew what was inside trees. Wood, sap, possibly squirrels. Not a pass. Still, The cushions underneath him were definitely softer than wood. The wine in the wooden cup beside him was much tastier than sap, and there could be absolutely no comparison between a squirrel and the girl sitting before him, clasping her knees and watching him thoughtfully, unless mention was made of certain hints of furriness. The room was high, wide, and lit with a soft yellow light, which came from no particular source that Rincewind could identify. Through gnarled and knotted archways, he could see other rooms, and what looked like a very large winding staircase. And it had looked a perfectly normal tree from the outside, too. The girl was green. Flesh green. Rincewind could be absolutely certain about that because all she was wearing was a medallion round her neck.
Throwing grenade!
Her long hair had a faintly mossy look. Her eyes had no pupils and were a luminous green. Rincewind wished he had paid more attention to anthropology lectures at university. She had said nothing. Apart from indicating the couch and offering him the wine, she had done no more than sit watching him, occasionally rubbing a deep scratch on her arm. Rincewind hurriedly recalled that a dryad was so linked to her tree that she suffered wounds in sympathy. Sorry about that, he said quickly. It was just an accident. I mean, there were these wolves and,
You had to climb my tree, and I rescued you.
said the dryad smoothly.
How lucky for you. And for your friend, perhaps?
Friend?
The little man with the magic box.
Said the dryad. Oh, sure, you, said Rincewind.
He needs your help.
He usually does. Did he make it to a tree too?
He made it to the temple of Bel Shamharom.
Rincewind choked on his wine. His ears tried to crawl into his head in terror of the syllables he just heard. The Soul Eater. Before he could stop them, the memories came galloping back. Once, while a student of practical magic at Unseen University, and for a bet, he'd slipped into the little room off the main library. The room with walls covered in protective lead pentagrams. The room no one was allowed to occupy for more than 4 minutes and 32 seconds, which was a figure arrived at after 200 years of cautious experimentation. He had gingerly opened the book, which was chained to the octyron pedestal in the middle of the room-strewn floor, not lest someone steal it, but lest it escape. For it was the Octavo, so full of magic that it had its own vague sentience. One spell had indeed leapt from the crackling pages and lodged itself in the dark recesses of his brain. And apart from knowing that it was one of the 8 great spells, no one would know which one until he said it. Even Rincewind didn't know, but he could feel it sometimes, sidling out of sight behind his ears, biding its time. On the front of the Octavo had been a representation of Bel Shamharom. He was not evil, for even evil has a certain vitality. Bel Shamharom was the flip side of the coin of which good and evil are but one side. The Soul Eater. His number lieth between 7 and 9. It eats twice more, Rincewind quoted, his mind frozen with fear. Oh, no. Where's the temple?
Upwards, towards the center of the forest,
Said the dryad.
It is very old.
Who would be so stupid as to worship him on the devils? Yes, but he's the Soul Eater.
There were certain advantages, and the race that used to live in these parts had certain notions.
What happened to them then?
I did say they used to live in these parts.
The dryad stood up and stretched out her hand.
Come, I am Drueli. Come with me and watch your friend's fate. It should be interesting.
I'm not sure that... began Rincewind. The dryad turned her green eyes on him. She huffed. A staircase, broad as a major highway, wound up through the tree with vast rooms leading off at every landing. The sourceless yellow light was everywhere. There was also a sound like Rincewind concentrated, trying to identify it, like far off or a distant water.
It's the tree,
said the dryad shortly. What's it doing? Said Rincewind.
living.
I wondered about that. I mean, are we really in a tree? Have I been reduced in size? From outside it looked narrow enough for me to put my arms round.
It is.
But here I am inside it.
You are.
Said Rincewind. Drueli laughed.
I can see into your mind, false wizard. Am I not a dryad? Do you not know that what you belittle by the name tree is but the mere four-dimensional analog of a whole multi-dimensional universe which... No, I can see you do not. I should have realized that you weren't a real wizard when I saw you didn't have a star.
You lost it in a fire, lied Rincewind automatically.
No hat with magic sigils recorded on it.
It blew off.
No familiar.
Pressing.
It died. Look, thanks for rescuing me, but if you don't mind, I think I ought to be going. If you could show me the way out. Something in her expression made him turn around. There were 3 he-dryads behind him. They were as naked as women. That last fact was irrelevant, however. They didn't look as though they would need weapons to fight Rincewind. They looked as though they could show their weight to a solid rock and beat up a regiment of trolls into the bargain. The 3 handsome giants looked down at him with wooden menace. Their skins were the colour of warm husks, and under it muscles bulged like sacks of melons. He turned around again and grinned weakly at Drueli. Life was beginning to take on a familiar shape again. I'm not rescued, am I? He said. I'm captured, right?
Of course.
And you're not letting me go. It was a statement. Drueli shook her head.
You hurt the tree. But you are lucky. Your friend is going to meet Bel-Sham-Harroth. You will only die.
From behind, 2 hands gripped his shoulders in much the same way that an old tree root coils relentlessly around a pebble.
With a certain amount of ceremony, of course,
the dryad went on.
after the sender of 8 has finished with your friend.
All Rincewind could manage to say was, you know, I never imagined there were he-dryads, not even in an oak tree. One of the giants grinned at him. Drueli snorted.
Stupid. Where do you think acorns come from?
There was a vast empty space like a hall, its roof lost in the golden haze. The endless stair ran right through it. Several hundred dryads were clustered at the other end of the hall. They parted respectfully when Drueli approached and stared through Rincewind as he was propelled firmly along behind. Most of them were females, although there were a few of the giant males among them. They stood like god-shaped statues among the small, intelligent females. Insects, thought Rincewind. The tree is like a hive. But why were there dryads at all? As far as he could recall, the tree people had died out centuries before. They had been out-evolved by humans, like most of the other Twilight peoples. Only elves and trolls had survived the coming of man to the Discworld. The elves because they were altogether too clever by half, and the trollen folk because they were at least as good as humans at being nasty, spiteful and greedy. Dryads were supposed to have died out along with gnomes and pixies. The background roar was louder here. Sometimes a pulsing golden glow would race up the translucent walls until it was lost in the haze overhead. Some power in the air made it vibrate.
Oh, incompetent wizard, said Drueli. See some magic. Not your weasel-faced tame magic, but root and branch magic. The old magic. Wild magic. Watch.
50 or so of the females formed a tight cluster, joined hands, and walked backwards until they formed the circumference of a large circle. The rest of the dryads began a low chant. Then, at a nod from Drueli, the circle began to spin widdershins. As the pace began to quicken and the complicated threads of the chant began to rise, Rincewind found himself watching, fascinated. He had heard about the old magic at university, although it was forbidden to wizards. He knew that when the circle was spinning fast enough against the standing magical field of the Discworld itself in its slow turning, the resulting astral friction would build up a vast potential difference which would earth itself by a vast discharge of the elemental magical force. The circle was a blur now, and the walls of the tree rang with the echoes of the chant. Rincewind felt the familiar sticky prickling in the scalp that indicated the build-up of a heavy charge of raw enchantment in the vicinity, and so he was not utterly amazed when a few seconds later a shaft of vivid octarine light speared down from the invisible ceiling and focused crackling in the center of the circle. There it formed an image of a storm-swept, tree-girt hill with a temple on its crest. Its shape did unpleasant things to the eye. Rincewind knew that if it was a temple to Bel-Shamharoth, it would have 8 sides. 8 was also the number of Bel-Shamharoth, which was why a sensible wizard would never mention the number if he could avoid it. Or you'll be 8 alive, apprentices were jocularly warned. Bel-Shamharoth was especially attracted to dabblers in magic, who by being as it were beachcombers on the shores of the unnatural, were already half enmeshed in his nets. Rincewind's room number in his hall of residence had been 7A. He hadn't been surprised. Rain streamed off the black walls of the temple. The only sign of life was the horse tethered outside, and it wasn't Two-Flower's horse. For one thing, it was too big. It was a white charger with hooves the size of meat dishes and leather harness a-glitter with ostentatious gold ornamentation. It was currently enjoying a nosebag.
Team deathmatch.
There was something familiar about it. Rincewind tried to remember where he'd seen it before. It looked as though it was capable of a fair turn of speed anyway. A speed which, once it had lumbered up to it, it could maintain for a long time. All Rincewind had to do was shake off his guards, fight his way out of the tree, find the temple, and steal the horse out from under whatever it was that Bel-Shamharoth used for a nose.
The sender of 8 has 2 for dinner, it seems,
said Drueli, looking hard at Rincewind.
Who does that feel, false wizard?
I've no idea.
No? Well, it does not matter.
We shall see. She waved a hand. The focus of the image moved inwards, darted through a great octagonal archway, and sped along the corridor within. There was a figure there, sidling along stealthily with its back against one wall. Rincewind saw the gleam of gold and bronze. There was no mistaking that shape. He'd seen it many times. The wide chest, the neck like a tree trunk, the surprisingly small head under its wild thatch of black hair, looking like a tomato on a coffin. It was the name of the creeping figure, and that name was Hrun the Barbarian. Hrun was one of Circle's more durable heroes, a fighter of dragons, a destroyer of temples, a hired sword, most of every street brawl. He could even, and unlike many heroes of Rincewind's acquaintance, speak words of more than 2 syllables, if given time, and maybe a hint or two. There was a sound on the edge of Rincewind's hearing. It sounded like several skulls bouncing down the depths of some distant dungeon. He looked sideways at his guards to see if they'd heard it. They had all their limited attention focused on Hrun, who was admittedly built on the same lines as themselves. Their hands were resting lightly on the wizard's shoulders. Rincewind ducked, jerked backwards like a tumbler, and came up running. Behind him, he heard Drueli shout, and he redoubled his speed. Something caught the hood of his robe, which tore off. A he-dryad waiting at the stairs spread his arms wide and grinned woodenly at the figure hurtling towards him. Without breaking his stride, Rincewind ducked again, so low that his chin was on level with his knees, while a fist like a log sizzled through the air like glue. Ahead of him, the whole spinney of the tree men awaited. He spun around, dodged another blow from the puzzled guard, and sped back towards the circle, passing on the way the dryads who were pursuing him and leaving them as disorganized as a set of skittles.
Objective almost complete.
But there was still more in front,
now.
pushing their way through the crowds of females and smacking their fists into the horny palms of their hands with anticipatory concentration.
Stand still, false wizard,
said Drueli, stepping forward. Behind her, the enchanted dancers spun on. The focus of the circle was now drifting along a violet-lit corridor. Rincewind cracked. Will you knock that off? He snarled. Let's just get this straight, eh? I am a real wizard. Petulantly.
Indeed,
said the dryad.
then let us see you pass a spell.
Began Rincewind. The fact was that since the ancient and mysterious spell had squatted in his mind, he had been unable to remember even the simplest cantrap for, say, killing cockroaches or scratching the small of his back without using his hands. The mages at Undersea University had tried to explain this by suggesting that the involuntary memorizing of the spell had, as it were, tied up all his spell retention cells. In his darker moments, Rincewind had come up with his own explanation as to why even minor spells refused to stay in his head for more than a few seconds. They were scared, he decided. He repeated.
A small one would do,
said Drueli, watching him curl his lips in a frenzy of anger and embarrassment. She signalled, and a couple of The spell chose that moment to vault into the temporarily abandoned saddle of Rincewind's consciousness. He felt it sitting there, leering defiantly at him. "I do know a spell," he said.
Pray tell,
said Drellai. Rincewind wasn't sure that he dared. Although the spell was trying to take control of his tongue, he fought it.
You said you could read my mind,
He said indistinctly.
read it.
She stepped forward, looking mockingly into his eyes. Her smile froze. Her hands raised protectively, she crouched back. From her throat came a sound of pure terror. Rincewind looked around. The rest of the Dryads were also backing away. What had he done? Something terrible, apparently. But in his experience, it was only a matter of time before the normal balance of the restored itself and started doing the usual terrible things to him. He backed away, ducked between the still-spinning Dryads who were creating the magic circle, and watched to see what Drellai would do next.
grab him,
She screamed.
take him a long way from the tree, and kill him.
Rincewind turned and bolted, across the focus of the circle. There was a brilliant flash. There was a sudden darkness. There was a vaguely Rincewind-shaped violet shadow dwindling to a point and winking out. There was nothing at all. Hrun, the barbarian, crept south, which were lit with a light so violet that it was almost black. His earlier confusion was gone. This was obviously a magical temple. That explained everything. It explained why, earlier in the afternoon, he had espied a chest by the side of the track while riding through this benighted forest. Its top was invitingly open, displaying much gold. But when he had leapt off his horse to approach it, the chest had sprouted legs and gone trotting off into the forest, stopping again a few hundred yards away. Now, after several hours of pursuit, he had lost it in these hell-lit tunnels. On the whole, the unpleasant carvings and occasional disjointed held no fears for Hrun. This was partly because he was not exceptionally bright, while being at the same time exceptionally unimaginative. But it was also because odd carvings and perilous tunnels were all in a day's work. He spent a great deal of time in similar situations, seeking gold or demons or distressed virgins, and relieving them respectively of their owners, their lives, and at least one cause of their distress. Observe Hrun as he leaps cat-footed across a suspicious tunnel mouth. Even in this violet light, his skin gleams coppery. There is much gold about his person, in the form of anklets and wristlets, but otherwise he is naked, except for a leopard skin loincloth. He took that in the steaming forests of Hawanda, after killing it. In his right hand, he carried the magical black sword, Kring, which was forged from a thunderbolt, and has a soul but suffers no scabbard. Hrun had stolen it only 3 days before from the impregnable palace of the Archmandrite of and it was beginning to get on his nerves.
I tell you, it went down that last passage on the right.
Hissed Kring, in a voice like the scrape of a blade over stone.
All I said was, shut up.
And Twoflower, he was lost. He knew that. Either the building was much bigger than it looked, or he was now on some wide underground level without having gone down any steps, or, as he was beginning to suspect, his inner dimension was their basic rule of architecture by being bigger than the outside. And why all these strange lights? They were 8-sided crystals, set at regular intervals in the walls and ceiling, and they shed a rather unpleasant glow that didn't so much illuminate as outline the darkness. And whoever had done those carvings on the wall, Twoflower thought charitably, had probably been drinking too much, for years. On the other hand, it was certainly a fascinating building. Its builders had been obsessed with it. The floor was a continuous mosaic of 8-sided tiles. The corridor walls and ceilings were angled to give the corridors 8 sides, walls and ceilings. And in those places where part of the masonry had fallen in, Twoflower noticed that even the stones themselves had 8 sides.
I don't like it,
said the picture imp from his box around Twoflower's neck. Why not? Inquired Twoflower.
it's weird.
But you're a demon. Demons can't call things weird. I mean, not weird with you.
Oh, you know.
Said the demon cautiously, glancing around nervously and shifting from claw to claw.
Things. Stuff.
Twoflower looked at him sternly. What things? The demon coughed nervously. Demons do not breathe. However, every intelligent being, whether it breathes or not, coughs nervously at some time in its life. And this was one of them as far as the demon was concerned.
Oh, things,
It said wretchedly.
evil things. Things we don't talk about is the point I'm broadly trying to get across, Master.
Two Flower shook his head wearily. I wish Rincewind was here, he said. He'd know what to do.
Him?
Sneered the demon.
Can't see a wizard coming here. They can't have anything to do with the number 8.
The demon slapped a hand across his mouth guiltily. Two Flower looked up at the ceiling. What was that? He asked. Didn't you hear something?
Me? Here? No, not a thing.
The demon insisted. It jerked back into its box and slammed the door. Two Flower tapped on it. The door opened a crack.
It sounded like a stone moving,
he explained. The door banged shut. Two Flower shrugged. This place is probably falling to bits, he said to himself. He stood up.
I say. Is anyone there? Is anyone there? Is anyone there? Hello? 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 I know there's someone there. I just heard you playing dice. I just heard you playing dice. Look, I have just...
Two Flower stopped. The reason for this was the bright point of light that had popped into existence a few feet from his eyes. It grew rapidly, and after a few seconds was the tiny bright shape of a man. At this stage, it began to make a noise, or rather, Two Flower started to hear the noise it had been making all along. It sounded like a sliver of a scream, caught in one long instant of time. The iridescent man was doll-sized now, a tortured shape tumbling in slow motion while hanging in mid-air. Two Flower wondered why he had thought of the phrase, a sliver of a scream, and began to wish he hadn't. It was beginning to look like Rincewind. The wizard's mouth was open, and his face was brilliantly lit by the light of... what? Strange suns, Two Flower found himself thinking. Suns men don't usually see. He shivered. Now the turning wizard was half man-sized. At that point, the growth was faster. There was a sudden crowded moment, a rush of air, and an explosion of sound. Rincewind tumbled out of the air, screaming. He hit the floor hard, choked, then rolled over with his head grazing in his arms, and his body curled up hard. When the dust had settled, Two Flower reached out gingerly and tapped the wizard on the shoulder. The human ball rolled up tighter. It's me, explained Two Flower helpfully. The wizard unrolled a fraction. What? Me! In one movement, Rincewind unrolled and bounced up in front of the little man, his hands gripping his shoulders desperately. His eyes were wild and wide. Don't say it, he hissed. Don't say it and we might get out. Get out? How did you get in? Don't say it. Two Flower backed away from this madman. Don't say it. Don't say what? The number. Number? Hey, Rincewind. Yes, number between 7 and 9. 4 plus 4. What? 8! Grenade! Rincewind's hands clapped over the man's mouth. Say it and we do. Just don't think about it, right? I don't understand, wailed Two Flower. Rincewind relaxed slightly, which was to say that he still made a violin string look like a bowl of jelly. Come on, he said. Let's try and get out. And I'll try and tell you. After the first age of magic, the disposal of grimoires began to become a severe problem on the Discworld. A spell is still a spell, even when imprisoned temporarily in parchment and ink. It has potency. This is not a problem while the book's owner still lives, but on his death, the spell book becomes a sort of uncontrolled power that cannot easily be diffused. In short, spellbooks leak magic. Various solutions have been tried. Countries near the rim simply loaded down the books of dead mages with leaden pentalphas and threw them over the edge. Near the hub, less satisfactory alternatives were available. Inserting the offending books in canisters of negatively polarized operative and sinking them in the fathomless depths of the sea was one. Land was earlier ruled out after some districts complained of walking trees and 5-headed cattle. But before along, the magic seeped out, and eventually fishermen complained of shoals of invisible fish, or psychic clams. A temporary solution was the construction in various centres of magical lore of large rooms made of denatured oxyron, which is impervious to most forms of magic. Here, the more critical grimoires could be stored until their potency had attenuated. That was how they came to be University, the Octave, the greatest of all grimoires, formerly owned by the creator of Magic. It was this book that Rincewind had once opened for a bet. He had only had a second to stare at a page before setting off various alarm spells, but this was time enough for one spell to leap from it and settle in his memory like a toad in a stone.
Then what?
Said Toonbow. Oh, they dragged me out and thrashed me, of course.
And no one knows what the spell does?
Rincewind shook his head. It has vanished from the page, he said. No one will know until I say it. Or until I die, of course. Then it will sort of say itself. For all I know, it stops the universe, or ends time, or anything. Enemy grenade! Toonflower patted him on the shoulder.
No sense in brooding, he said cheerfully. Let's have another look for a way out.
Rincewind shook his head. All the terror had been spent now. He had broken through the terror barrier, perhaps, and was in the dead calm state of mind that lies on the other side. Anyway, he had ceased to gibber. We're doomed, he stated. We've been walking around all night. I tell you, this place is a spider. No matter which way we go, we'll end up in the centre.
It was kind of you to come looking for me anyway, said Toonflower. How did you manage it exactly? It was very impressive.
Oh, well, began the wizard awkwardly. I just thought, I can't leave old Toonflower there. So what we've got to do now is find this Bel-Shamharoth person and explain things to him, and perhaps he'll let us out, said Toonflower. Ran around his ear. It must be the funny echoes in here. I thought I heard you use words like find and explain.
That's right.
Rincewind glared at him in the hellish purple glow. Find Bel-Shamharoth, he said.
Yes, we don't have to get involved.
Find the soul director. And look him. Just give him a nod, I suppose, and ask the way to the exit. Explain things to the sender of the aim. Rincewind bit off the end of the word just in time and finished. You're insane. Hey, come back. He darted down the passage, and after a few moments came to a halt with a groan. The violet light was intense here, giving everything new and unpleasant colours. This wasn't a passage. It was a wide room with walls to a number that Rincewind didn't dare to contemplate, and 8 and 7A passages radiating from it. Rincewind saw, a little way off, a low altar with the same number of sides as 4 times 2. It didn't occupy the centre of the room, however. The centre was occupied by a huge stone slab with twice as many sides as a square. It looked massive. In the strange light, it appeared to be slightly tilted, with one edge standing flat. Toonflower was standing on it.
Hey, Rincewind, look what's here.
The luggage came ambling down one of the other passages that radiated from the room. That's good, said Rincewind. Fine, it can lead us out of here. Now. Toonflower was already rummaging in the chest.
Yes, he said. After I've taken a few pictures, just let me fit the attachment.
I said now. Rincewind stopped. Harun the Barbarian was standing in the passage mouth, directly opposite him. A great black sword held in one ham-sized fist. You? Said Harun uncertainly. Yes, said Rincewind. Harun, isn't it? Long time no see. What brings you here? Harun pointed to the luggage. He said. Reload! This much conversation seemed to exhaust Harun. Then he added in a tone that combined statement, claim, threat, and ultimatum. Reload! It belongs to Toonflower here, said Rincewind. Here's a tip. Don't touch it. It dawned on him that that was precisely the wrong thing to say, but Harun had already pushed Toonflower away and was reaching for the luggage, which sprouted legs, backed away, and raised its lid threateningly. In the uncertain light, Rincewind thought he could see rows of enormous teeth, white as bleached beechwood. Harun, he said quickly, there's something I ought to tell you. Harun turned a puzzled face to him. What? He said. It's It's about numbers. Look, you know if you add 7 and 1, or 3 and 5, or take 2 from 10, you get a number. While you're here, don't say it, and we might all stand a chance of getting out of here alive. Or merely just dead.
Who is he?
Asked Two-Flower. He was holding a cage in his hands, dredged from the bottommost depths of the lightning. It appeared to be full of sulking pink lizards. I am Harun, said Harun proudly. Then he looked at Rincewind. Move, he said. Just don't say it, okay? Said Rincewind. He looked at the sword in Harun's hand. It was black, the sort of black that is less a colour than a graveyard of colours, and there was a highly ornate runic inscription up the blade. More noticeable still was the faint octarine glow that surrounded it. The sword must have noticed him too, because it suddenly spoke in a voice like a claw being scraped across glass.
Strange, it said. Why can't he say 8? 8. 8.
There was the faintest of grinding noises deep under the earth, and the echoes, although they became softer, refused to die away. They bounced from wall to wall, crossing and recrossing, and the violet light flickered in time with the sound. "You did it!" screamed Rincewind. "I said you shouldn't say 8! He stopped, appalled at himself, but the word was out now and joined its colleagues in the general susurration. Rincewind turned to run, but the air suddenly seemed to be thicker than treacle. A charge of magic bigger than he had ever seen was building up. When he moved in painful slow motion, his limbs left trails of golden sparks that traced their shape in the air. Behind him there was a rumble as the great octagonal slab rose into the air, hung for a moment on one edge, and crashed down on the floor. Something thin and black snaked out of the pit and wrapped itself around his ankle. He screamed as he landed heavily on the vibrating flagstones. The tentacles started to pull him across the floor. Then Two-Flower was in front of him, reaching out for his hands. He grasped the little man's arms desperately, and they lay looking into each other's faces. Rincewind slid on, even so. "What's holding you?" he gasped. "Nothing," said Two-Flower. "What's happening?" "I'm being dragged into this pit. What do you think?" "Oh, Rincewind, I'm sorry." "You're sorry." There was a noise like a singing saw, and the pressure on Rincewind's legs abruptly ceased. He turned his head and saw Harun, crouched by the pit, his sword a blur, as it hacked at the tentacles racing out towards him. Two-Flower helped the wizard to his feet, and they crouched by the altar stone, watching the manic figure as it battled the questing arms. "It won't work," said Rincewind. "The sender can materialize tentacles. What are you doing?" Two-Flower was feverishly attaching the cage of subdued lizards to the picture box, which he had mounted on a tripod. "I've just got to get a picture of this," he muttered. "It's stupendous. Can you hear me, Imp?" The picture imp opened his tiny hatch, glanced momentarily at the scene around the pit, and vanished into the box. Rincewind jumped as something touched his leg, and brought his heel down on a questing tentacle. "Come on," he said, "time to go zoom." He grabbed Two-Flower's arm, but the tourist resisted. "Run away and leave Harun with that thing," he said. Rincewind looked blank. "Why not?" he said. "It's his job." "But it'll kill him." "Could be worse," said Rincewind. "What?" "Could be us," Rincewind pointed out logically. "Come on." Two-Flower pointed.
Hey, you got my luggage.
Before Rincewind could restrain him, Two-Flower ran around the edge of the pit to the box, which was being dragged across the floor, while its lid snapped ineffectually at the tentacle that held it. The little man began to kick at the tentacle in fury. Another one snapped out of the melee around Harun and caught him around the waist. Harun himself was already an indistinct shape amid the tightening coil. Even as Rincewind stared in horror, the hero's sword was wrenched from his grasp and hurled against a wall. "Your spell!" shouted Two-Flower. Rincewind did not move. He was looking at the thing rising out of the pit. It was an enormous eye, and it was staring directly at him. He whimpered as a tentacle fastened itself around his lips. The words of the spell rose unbidden in his throat. He opened his mouth as in a dream, shaping it around the first barbaric. Another tentacle shot out like a whip and coiled around his throat, choking him. Staggering and gasping, Rincewind was dragged across the floor. One flailing arm caught Two-Flower's picture box as it skittered past on its front. He snatched it up instinctively, as his ancestors might have snatched up a stone when faced with a maroon eye. pitted against the eye. The eye filled the whole universe in front of him. Rincewind felt his will draining away like water from a sieve. In front of him, the torpid lizards stirred in their cage on the picture box. Irrationally, as a man about to be beheaded notices every scratch and stain on the execution block, Rincewind saw that they had overlarge tails that were bluish-white, and he realized throbbing alarmingly. As he was drawn towards the eye, the terror-struck Rincewind raised the box protectively, and at the same time heard the picture imp say,
They're about right now. Can't hold them any longer. Everyone smile, please.
There was a flash of light so white and so bright, it didn't seem like light at all. Belle Shunharov screamed, a sound that started in the far ultrasonic and finished somewhere in Rincewind's bowels. The tentacles went momentarily as stiff as rods, hurling their various cargoes around the room, before bunching up protectively in front of the abused eye. The whole mass dropped into the pit, and a moment later the big slab was snatched up by several dozen tentacles and slammed into place, leaving a number of thrashing limbs trapped around the edge. Harun landed rolling, bounced off the wall, and came up on his feet. He found his sword and started methodically in the deep burrow. Rincewind lay on the floor, concentrating on not going mad. A hollow wooden noise made him turn his head. The luggage had landed on its curved lid. Now it was rocking angrily and kicking its little legs in the air. Warily, Rincewind looked around for Two-Flower. The little man stood a couple of feet against the wall, but at least he was groaning. The wizard pulled himself off the floor and whispered, "What the hell was that?" "Why were they so bright?" muttered Two-Flower. "Gods, my head!" "Too bright?" said Rincewind. He looked across the floor to the cage on the picture box. The lizards inside, now noticeably thinner, were watching him with interest. "The salamanders," told Two-Flower. "The picture was exposed, now you know it." "They're salamanders?" asked Rincewind incredulously. "Of course. Standard attachment." Rincewind snatched across to the box and picked it up. He'd seen salamanders before, of course, but they'd been small specimens. They'd also been floating in a jar of pickle in the Children's Biological Museum down at the cellars of the Unseen University, since live salamanders were extinct around the Circle Sea. Remember the little clue about them. They were magical creatures. They also had no mouths, since they subsisted entirely on the direct quality of octoline wavelength in the Discworld sunlight, which they absorbed through their skin. Of course, they also absorbed the rest of the sunlight as well, storing it in a special sac until it was excreted in the normal way. A desert inhabited by Discworld salamanders was a veritable lighthouse at night. Rincewind put them down and nodded grimly. With all the octoline light and magical qualities, the creature had been gorging, and then nature had taken its course. The picture box sidled away on its tripod. Rincewind aimed a kick at it and missed. He was beginning to dislike sapient pearwood. Something small stung his cheek. He brushed it away irritably. He looked around at a sudden grinding noise, and a voice like a carving knife cutting through silk said,
This is very undignified.
"Shut up," said Harun. He was using Kring to lever the top off the altar. He looked up at Rincewind and grinned. Rincewind hoped that Richter-struck grimace was a grin. "Mighty magic," commented the barbarian, pushing down heavily on the complaining blade with a hand the size of a hand. Rincewind grunted as something small and hard struck him. A gust of wind Rincewind felt. "How'd you know his treasure was there?" he said, and managed to hook his finger over the stone. "You find choke apples under a choke apple tree," he said. "You find treasure under altars. Logic." He gritted his teeth. The stone swung up and landed heavily on the floor. This time, something struck Rincewind's hand heavily. He clawed the air and looked at the thing he had caught. It was a piece of stone with 5+3 sides. He looked up at the ceiling. Should it be sagging like that? Harun hummed a little tune and began to pull crumbling leather from the desecrated altar. The air crackled. flapping it out in eddies of blue and green sparks. Around Rince's head, mad, half-formed spirits howled and gibbered as they were sucked past. He tried raising a hand. It was immediately surrounded by a glowing octarine corona as the rising magical wind roared past. The gale raced through the room without stirring one iota of dust, yet it was blowing Rincewind's eyelids with its high. It screamed along the tunnels, its banshee wail bouncing madly from stone to stone. Two flowers staggered up, bent double in the teeth of the astral gale.
What the hell is this?
He shouted. Rincewind half turned. Immediately the howling wind caught him, nearly pitching him over. Poltergeist eddies spinning in the rushing air snatched at his feet. Harun's arm shot out and caught him. A moment later, he and Tigger had been dragged into the knee of the ravaged altar and lay panting on the floor. Beside them, the talking sword Kring sparkled, its magical field boosted 100-fold by the storm.
Hold on!
Screamed Rincewind.
The wind!
Shouted Twoflower.
Where's it coming from? Where's it blowing to?
He looked into Rincewind's mask of sheer terror, which made him redouble his own grip on the stone.
Great teamwork.
We're doomed, murmured Rincewind, while overhead the roof cracked and shifted.
Where do shadows come from? That's where the wind is blowing.
What was in fact happening, as the wizard knew, was that as the abused spirit of Bel Shamharoth sank through the deeper Chthonic plains, his brooding spirit was being sucked out of the very stones into the region which, according to the Discworld's most reliable priests, was both under the ground and somewhere else. In consequence, his temple was being abandoned to the ravages of time, who for thousands of shamefaced years had been reluctant to go near the place. Now, the suddenly released accumulated weight of all those pent-up seconds was bearing down heavily on the unbraced stones. Harun glanced up at the widening cracks and sighed. Then he put two fingers into his mouth and whistled. Strangely, the real sound rang out loudly over the pseudo-sound of the widening astral whirlpool that was forming in the middle of the great octagonal slab. It was followed by a hollow echo, which sounded, he fancied, strangely like the bouncing of strange bones. Then came a noise with no hint of strangeness. It was hollow hoofbeats. Harun's warhorse cantered through a creaking archway and reared up by its master, its mane streaming in the gale. The barbarian pulled himself to his feet and slung his treasure bags into a sack that hung from the saddle, then hauled himself onto the beast's back. He reached down and grabbed Twoflower by the scruff of his neck, dragging him across the saddle tree. As the horse turned around, Rincewind took a desperate leap and landed behind Harun, who raised no objection. The horse pounded sure-footed along the tunnels, leaping sudden slides of rubble and adroitly sidestepping huge stones as they thundered down from the straining roof. Rincewind, clinging on grimly, looked behind them. No wonder the horse was moving so swiftly. Close behind, speeding through the flickering violet light, were a large, ominous chest and a picture box that skittered along dangerously on its three legs. So great was the ability of sapient pearwood to follow its master anywhere, the grave goods of dead animals had traditionally been made of it. They reached the outer air, a moment before the octagonal arch finally broke and smashed into the ground. The sun was rising. Behind them, a column of dust rose as the temple collapsed in on itself. But they did not look back. That was a shame, because Twoflower might have been able to obtain pictures unusual even by Discworld standards. There was movement in the smoking ruins. They seemed to be growing a green carpet. Then an oak tree spiraled up, branching out like a stony green rocket, and was in the middle of a venerable copse even before the tips of its aged branches had stopped quivering. A beech burst out like a fungus, matured, rotted, and fell in a cloud of tinder dust amidst its struggling offspring. Already the temple was a half-buried heap of mossy stones. But time, having initially got to the place, was now setting out to complete the job. The boiling interface between decaying magic and ascendant entropy roared down the hill and overtook the galloping horse, whose riders, being themselves creatures of time, completely failed to notice it. But it lashed into the enchanted forest with the whip of centuries.
Grenade!
Impressive, isn't it?
Observed a voice by Rincewind's knee as the horse cantered through the haze of decaying timber and falling leaves. The voice had an eerie, metallic ring to it. Rincewind looked down at Kring the sword. It had a couple of rubies set in the pommel. He got the impression they were watching him. From the warlike watched the battle between the trees and time, which could only have one ending. It was a sort of cabaret to the main business of the halt, which was the consumption of quite a lot of a bear, which had incautiously come within bowshot of Harun. Rincewind watched Harun over the top of his slab of greasy meat. Harun, going about the business of being a hero, he realized, was quite different to the wine-bibbing, carousing Harun, who occasionally came to arm more pork. He was cat-cautious, lithe as a panther, quietly hung. And I've survived Bel-Shan-Haroth, Rincewind reminded himself. Fantastic. The hero sought through the treasure stolen from the temple. It was mostly silver, set with representations of spiders, octopi, and the tree-dwelling Octarsia, cosmic wastes, figured largely. Rincewind tried to shut his ears to the grating voice beside him. It was no use.
And then I belonged to the Pasha of Rif-Durat and played a prominent part in the Battle of Great Neff, which is where I received a slight nick. You may have noticed some 2/3 of the way up my blade.
Green was saying from his temporary home in Passer.
Some infidel was wearing an Oxyron collar, most unsporting, and of course I was a lot sharper in those days, and my master used to use me to cut silk handkerchiefs in midair. And am I boring you?
Huh? Oh, no, not at all. It's all very interesting, said Rincewind, with his eyes still on Harun. How trustworthy would he be? Here they were, out in the wilds. There were trolls about.
I could see you were a cultured person,
Kring went on.
So seldom do I get to meet really interesting people for any length of time anyway. What I really like is a nice mountain hangover, somewhere nice and quiet. I spent a couple of 100 years on the bottom of a lake once.
That must have been fun, said Rincewind absently.
Not really.
Said Kring. No, I suppose not.
What I'd really like is to be a ploughshare. I don't know what that is, but it sounds like an existence with some point to it.
Two-Flower hurried over to the wizard.
I had a great idea,
he burbled. Yeah, said Rincewind wearily. Why don't we get Harun to accompany us to Quirb? Two-Flower looked at him. How do you know? He said. I just thought you'd think of it, said Rincewind. Harun ceased stuffing silverware into saddlebags and grinned encouragingly at them. Then his eyes strayed back to the luggage. If we had him with us, who'd attack us? Rincewind scratched his chin. Harun, he suggested. But we saved his life in the temple. Well, if by attack you mean kill, said Rincewind. I don't think he'd do that. He's not that sort. He'd just rob us and tie us up and leave us for the wolves, I expect. Oh, come on. This is real life, snapped Rincewind. I mean, here you are, carrying around a box full of gold. Don't you think anyone in their right minds would jump at the chance of pinching it? I think I haven't seen what the luggage does to prying fingers. Then the answer hit him. He looked from Harun to the picture box. The picture imp was doing its laundry in a tiny hut, while the salamanders dozed in their cave. I've got an idea, he said. I mean, what is it heroes really want? Gold, said Two-Flower. No, I mean, Two-Flower frowned. I don't quite understand, he said. The picture box. Harun, he said. Come over here, will you? The days passed peacefully. True, a small band of bridge trolls tried to ambush them on one occasion, and a party of brigands nearly caught them unawares one night, but unwisely tried to investigate the luggage before slaughtering the sleepers. Harun demanded, and got, double pay for both occasions. If any harm comes to us, said Rincewind, then no more pictures of Harun. Understand? Harun nodded, his eyes fixed. He showed Harun striking a heroic pose with one foot on a heap of slain trolls. Get on, okay, he said. said.
Also, tomorrow, may we get a better profile, okay?
He carefully wrapped the picture in troll skin and stowed it in his saddlebag, along with the others. It seems to be working, said Two-Flower, admiring, as Hurun rode ahead to scout the road. Sure, said Rincewind, what heroes like best is themselves. Picture box, you know that? Yeah. So you might like to have this. Two-Flower held out a picture. What is it? Asked Rincewind. Rincewind looked in horror. There, bordered by a few glimpses of tentacles, was a huge, warm, callous, potion-stained, and unfocused. That's the story, he said wearily. You, said Fate, pushing the heap of souls across the gaming table. The assembled gods relaxed. There will be other games, he added.
Knew we'd win
The
this
lady smiled into two eyes that were like holes in the universe. And then there was nothing but the ruin of the forests and a cloud of dust on the horizon which drifted away on the breeze. And sitting on a pitted and moss-grown milestone, a black and raggedy figure. His was the air of one who is unjustly put upon, who is dreaded and feared, yet who is the only friend of the poor and the best doctor for the mortally wounded. Death, although of course completely eyeless, watched Rincewind disappearing with what would, had his face